Excellent. So the recording is started. So we can get into the agenda for today's meeting. First, we'll start with welcome and introductions again, just so everyone's aware of who's on the call. Then we'll have a definition on efforts to define clean hydrogen that have been engaged in so far through this task force proceeding, really focusing on some of the discussion that's been going on in the policy and workforce development working group and sharing it out to this group for consideration and comments. Next, we'll be looking at some preliminary hydrogen supply assessments developed by my team, looking closely at costs and volumes and some discussion around, different emissions intensities in relation to the clean hydrogen standard. Then we'll spend 15 minutes on discussion and next steps. Quick reminder of Strategen's role. I won't go through this in much detail either. It's been presented at a number of past working group meetings, and I'd like to leave more time for introductions. So I'll go ahead and call on people as they appear in my participant list. And once you have, are called, please provide your name and your organization, kind of where you're coming from. So let's start with Paula Resta.
Hi, this is Paula Resta. I'm with the Council on Environmental Quality.
Bernie, next.
Good morning. I'm Bernie Pelletier. I'm with People's Action for Clean Energy, called PACE, from the environmental sector.
Perfect. Enrique?
Yeah, good morning, Enrique Bosch. I'm the head of innovation at Avangrid.
Thanks for joining, Enrique. Carrie Lynch?
Carrie Lynch, the Nature Conservancy.
Welcome, Carrie. John Feinstein?
Jonathan Feinstein from ZoneFlow Reactor Technologies, a hydrogen development company in Bridgeport, Connecticut.
Awesome. Jordan?
Thanks, Colin. Jordan Ahern, intern at Strategen, handling meeting minutes.
Thanks, Jordan. Tony?
Hi, I'm Tony Leo from Fuel Cell Energy.
Wheezy?
Hi folks, Wheezy Nuora, State Policy Director for Dominion Energy. We held the last task force meeting at Millstone.
Nina?
Nina Hebel, I'm with Strategen.
Uber?
Uber Pashola, University of Connecticut.
Thanks, Uber. I'll also point out that Uber is one of the co-chairs of this task force. Samantha?
Hi, Sam Danowski, she/her. I'm the State Director of Sierra Club's Connecticut chapter.
Thanks. Sarah Harari?
Morning, Sarah Harari. I'm the Associate Director of Innovation and Senior Advisor to the President at the Connecticut Bank. And made it safely back from the Catalyst Hydrogen Conference this week. So thank you to Strategen for hosting that.
Of course, yeah. Also coming off that conference myself. So getting back into the swing of things. Shannon?
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Shannon Lawn. I'm an attorney and the Connecticut State Director for Conservation Law Foundation.
Welcome. Sridhar?
Hi, this is Sridhar Kanuri from High Axiom.
Welcome, Sridhar. And finally, Becca?
Yeah, hi everybody. Becca Treach at Connecticut Deep, Senior Policy Advisor, focused primarily on the comprehensive energy strategy.
Welcome. I also see a phone number, 860-306. Is that someone who's already been called on, or is there another person on the call?
Hi, just a member of the public, Brooks Campaign from Robinson and Cole.
Oh, great. Thank you for joining. Is there anyone else on the call that I forgot or skipped over? Excellent. Well, now that we're all acquainted, we can move into the second portion of the agenda. Quick overview of the upcoming meeting schedule. As John mentioned at the beginning of this call, there's one more working group after this for the for all the working groups. The sources working group, the next one will be a joint working group with the uses working group. So it'll be an hour and a half long, and will be on December 20th. So, please come celebrate your holidays a little early, I guess, with us and the sources working or uses working group. All right, so now getting into the first segment of the presentation, I wanted to give an overview of some of the discussion that's been going on primarily in the Policy and Workforce Development Working Group on proposed definitions for clean hydrogen. So as a reminder, establishing that definition is in this working group's charter in coordination with the Policy and Workforce Development Group, which has really been taking the lead on this effort. So the following is sort of a summary of some of the discussions that have been going on as part of that working group. It's not necessarily the positions of this working group specifically, but wanted to provide an overview of those developments for everyone's review and comments. So one of the primary steps that the Policy and Working Group has taken in their discussions is to start looking at moving away from a kind of color-based definition system for hydrogen and one that's focused on carbon intensity. For those that are unfamiliar, you'll often hear hydrogen referred to by different colors: green, blue, gray, pink. The colors don't correspond to the color of the actual product or molecule. It's a reference to how the hydrogen was created and what sort of renewable energy sources, whether it be renewable energy, natural gas, nuclear, some other source, were used to create that hydrogen. And it's been kind of adopted as a shorthand for talking about the climate neutrality of producing hydrogen. But the discussion in the Policy and Workforce Development Working Group has been looking at moving away from this color-based system to one that's focused on what that color system is meant to kind of speak to, which is the carbon intensity of hydrogen production from different sources. And so the idea is to move towards a definition that's focused on carbon intensity, which allows for a more technology-neutral approach and focusing on the technologies that allow us to produce hydrogen at the required level of greenhouse gas emissions, the required threshold for greenhouse gas emissions, which would be defined as part of the definition that is developed. For reference, the federal guidance on clean hydrogen production has also moved towards a carbon intensity framework, which I'll dive into in a bit more detail in future slides. The goal of that framework is to identify clean hydrogen as hydrogen that produces less than 4 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen produced on a life cycle basis, which the federal government sort of defines as a well-to-gate standard. And so what that means is that 4 kilograms of hydrogen would include upstream emissions that go into producing that hydrogen, as well as emissions produced at the point of production. There's no indication at this point that the federal standard would include anything beyond that. It wouldn't look at, the carbon required to produce the steel that goes into the electrolyzers. Those would be emitted from the frame of analysis. But it is designed to consider a more wide-reaching set of emissions than just the emissions that are produced from the production of hydrogen. As I said, I'll get into more detail about that later. We'll do a deep dive at a separate point, but I just want to point out some key considerations that have been identified when developing a carbon intensity-based definition. First, it has to be based on something that's quantifiable. You have to be able to actually identify the emissions from a particular hydrogen production source. As I mentioned, there needs to be agreement and alignment on the threshold for CO2e, for carbon dioxide equivalent, that is allowed. The federal guidance uses 4 kilograms, but the threshold could be higher or lower depending on how the definition is set. The intensity-based definition should consider life cycle impacts, or should identify whether it considers life cycle impacts and what it includes in that life cycle. Consideration should be given to whether it supports technology neutral approach, and details around how it would be certified so that the definition can be functional and useful to people who are actually in the business of producing hydrogen. The policy working group has also been discussing and reviewing sort of national and international approaches for clean hydrogen. So in addition to the federal government, a number of states and countries and other parts of the world have looked at different approaches for defining clean hydrogen. You'll see technology agnostic approaches tend to predominate, but there are some places that have taken different approaches, some specifying only renewable energy would qualify, or hydrogen produced from renewable energy would qualify as clean hydrogen. Others looking at definitions that explicitly exclude the use of fossil fuels. So looking more closely at the federal guidance, as mentioned before, the federal definition focuses on emissions intensity. And is, as I mentioned, has identified 4 kilograms of carbon dioxide emissions equivalent per kilogram of hydrogen as the threshold for something to qualify as clean hydrogen. If something emits more than that, then it would not qualify under this definition, so would not be eligible for the production tax credit and other federal subsidies and policy supports that different federal legislation provides to clean hydrogen production. Going into a bit more detail on what that means, or the specifics of that definition. So 4 kilograms per CO2 equivalent is the threshold. It also specifies that less than 2 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent can be produced at the point of production. And so what that means is, there's a point of production where hydrogen is, or natural gas or electricity is turned into hydrogen. So if you use an electrolyzer to split water into hydrogen and oxygen, there's no carbon dioxide associated with that process specifically. And so the only emissions that would be considered would be the upstream emissions. So, what was the emission intensity of the electricity that was used to produce the hydrogen? Looking at it from that standpoint, if the electricity that was used to produce the hydrogen also releases no emissions, so if it was fully solar or fully wind or fully sourced from zero carbon electricity sources, then that hydrogen would have 0 emissions both at the point of production and upstream of production. So it would have 0 kilograms of hydrogen, or 0 CO2 emissions overall. If you were to create hydrogen from reforming methane, so using natural gas, then that process does release emissions at the point of production. It's significantly more than 4 kilograms per carbon dioxide equivalent for that process. So that process would not qualify as clean hydrogen. If the facility were able to capture the carbon dioxide that was emitted through that process and sequester it, then the sequestered carbon dioxide would not count towards that 2 kilograms limit at the point of production. And so depending on the capture rate of carbon dioxide for steam methane reforming, it is possible for steam methane reforming with carbon capture to meet that federal standard. However, using methane to produce hydrogen would also consider upstream emissions of methane. So any emissions that would occur along the supply chain to get the methane to that hydrogen to the point where the hydrogen is produced. And so if there's leakage along the pipelines, if there's leakage at the point where the methane is kind of at the drill sites, then those emissions and those leakage rates would have to be considered in the overall life cycle, the well to gate emissions accounting that this clean hydrogen standard takes into account. So that's a overview of kind of how some different production methods for hydrogen kind of fit into this federal standard. Happy to go into more detail about that in the Q&A period. But the other thing I wanted to point out is that other states in the US have opted to create their own definitions for clean hydrogen. There are varying approaches to how they tackled this, but it's usually based on the region-specific climate goals and their goals around technology development, as well as geographic considerations, kind of what hydrogen production methods would likely make the most sense in those, or that the state feels would make the most sense in that particular geographic region. And so what that means is there is the option for states to develop their own definition of clean hydrogen, which is something that Connecticut could consider in order to provide flexibility in creating a clean hydrogen definition that better caters to Connecticut's specific climate goals. So it's advised, I'd say, that Connecticut's definition of clean hydrogen, at the very least, align with federal standards in order to maximize the state's ability to access federal funding, which is dependent on meeting that federal standard. It will be necessary to meet that standard to receive the full production tax credits provided by the IRA. It may also help facilitate hydrogen imports from states in the regional hydrogen hub, who presumably would also be abiding by the same standard. It's also, as mentioned, a technology neutral approach, which can accommodate a broad set of different technologies. However, given Connecticut's climate goals and other considerations, the state could also establish its own state-specific definition for clean hydrogen that could be more stringent, maybe focusing on renewable or zero carbon production of hydrogen in order to acknowledge the benefit of having hydrogen produced by through methods that have a reduced carbon footprint than even the federal standard would specify. Connecticut also has some regional climate legislation that would dovetail well with a more stringent hydrogen standard. In particular, its 100% carbon-free power requirements, may require certain hydrogen used in certain applications be zero carbon in order to actually allow the state to meet that target. And establishing a more stringent carbon intensity standard could allow the state to develop its own, more specific, or could be used in state-specific policy support or kind of policy inclusion of green hydrogen in the state's clean energy ecosystem. For example, by allowing hydrogen to qualify as a Class 1 resource under the RPS program. So that's sort of an overview of some of the discussion that's been going on. A number of those slides have been presented at past policy working group meetings, and so you may have seen them if you attend those meetings as well. This particular slide is still under discussion within the sort of policy working group, and so hasn't you wouldn't have seen that in past presentations. But I wanted to put it in front of everyone because I think that is one of the key areas for discussion, or that would be useful to focus on in discussion. So first, outlining some of the next steps. As mentioned, this definition will be further refined and finally confirmed in coordination with a policy and workforce development working group as part of this task force initiative. And so at the current point in the process, I want to provide an opportunity for everyone on in this working group to provide feedback on the discussion, in particular, any thoughts or concerns about carbon intensity framework for defining clean hydrogen, or a tiered approach to defining clean hydrogen that includes both the federal definition and a more stringent state level definition. Also interested in understanding what people's thoughts are around what a more stringent criteria for clean hydrogen should consider if one were to be developed.
Are you asking for our comments now?
Yes, so I adjusted the presentation a bit from the deck I sent out earlier. I thought it would make sense to tackle one topic at a time. And so right now we'll go into the discussion section for the clean hydrogen definition slides that were just presented.
Well, yeah, I'll jump in and just suggest, I would highly argue that we follow the federal standard. If you think about, what we're doing in the hubs, we ended up being in a broader group involving a bunch of Northeast states. I mean, I think it's wonderful that there's a federal standard. And, we've commented on the federal standard, and I highly recommend that we adopt the federal standard.
Thanks, Tony. Any other thoughts at this time?
Yeah. This is John Feinstein. Is that all right?
John and then Bernie.
Okay. The DOE has sent out a request for defining how they would count carbon footprint and use this new IRA, how that law should be written, what things should be considered and what other things. So that's yet to be known. But I'm wondering, my question is, the DOE and the EPA recognize the carbon footprints of solar and wind power. Will those be recognized in this study?
So our understanding is that there's no indication this time that the federal standard is going to consider things like embodied in carbon, which I assume is kind of what you're referring to, kind of the emissions that go into producing the steel and other materials that actually that you need to actually build a solar panel or a wind turbine. Those things would not be considered in the universe of emissions that will be considered for or as part of this federal standard. As you said, like there's still ongoing consideration of how it will be defined, and there are some LCA frameworks that do include those sorts of emissions, but based on the guidance that's been produced by the DOE up till now, those types of emissions are excluded.
Do you know where that guidance can be found?
Definitely. I usually find it just by Googling clean hydrogen production standard draft guidance. But I can go find the exact website and send you the link if you'd like.
Thank you.
I guess I'm next. This is Bernie from PACE. I do agree with Tony Leo's comment that we, at a minimum, should adopt a federal standard. It just would make work in the region possible, as well as accessing all the rebates, as you pointed out. I would suggest that we go farther. If my memory is right, I think France would be an example where not only did they essentially adopt a carbon intensity standard, but they also said we're not going to run fossil fuels through a mechanism to produce hydrogen as a source. My own belief is that by the costs and the environmental impacts of running a fossil fuel through to produce hydrogen, it wouldn't be economic, but I think belt and suspenders, I would just rule it out from the get-go. That's my comment.
Thanks, Bernie.
Okay, we have a couple more hands from Samantha and then Tony. So.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Sam Danowski from Sierra Club. Just to piggyback on Bernie's comment, a number of organizations have submitted a letter on this to the task force, urging that that we adopt a clean hydrogen definition that includes only non-fossil fuel, 100% zero carbon feedstock, that will both align with the federal standard and help us meet our own in-state greenhouse gas reduction goals, which we are nowhere near achieving and are off track at this moment. We oppose the allowing fossil fuels, biomass, or methane-based gas as a feedstock with or without carbon capture, because there's research that shows that fossil fuel hydrogen alone and fossil fuel hydrogen with carbon capture really eviscerates the intended climate benefits. It increases rather than decreases total greenhouse gas emissions. And folks, that organizations, across the state that advocate for reducing greenhouse gas emissions in order to address climate change, that have, in support of these comments include Sierra Club Connecticut, Acadia Center, Environment Connecticut, Connecticut Citizen Action Group, the Connecticut League of Conservation Voters, the Connecticut Coalition of Economic and Environmental Justice, and Save the Sound, among others. I think that letter is in the record, but I would be glad to provide a link if it's not. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam.
Tony,
Yeah,
did you
yeah.
have?
Yeah, I think I'm next. Just a couple comments. One, I think you're right in the sense that when you mentioned that they're not going to look at the amount of carbon that was produced making the steel in the electrolyzer. But one thing that is getting discussed a lot is that there may be some allowance for an assumption that if there's a certain percentage of leakage of hydrogen, there's this notion that hydrogen can be a indirect greenhouse gas promoter. So you may see at some point that get wrapped into the clean hydrogen production standard, which would almost mean there's no such thing as zero. And so that's one of the things that DOE is looking at, I know. And the other thing I would say is that, I certainly agree that zero carbon renewable is best, but a couple comments. One, I don't think of biogas as a fossil fuel, but two, Connecticut's a small state and we're not an island. And if there's low carbon hydrogen, in pipelines or whatever, that's part of the hydrogen ecosystem, I mean, I don't think we want to turn those trucks away at the border. So that's just one thing we need to think about if we think about, going our own with a unique standard.
Thanks, Tony. Is there anyone else with their hands raised, Nina? Sorry, I'm not able to see from my point on the screen.
No, that's everything. That's everyone.
Oh, sorry.
Now. Oh, never mind. John?
Okay. Could I ask one more question? If solar reduces the footprint of electricity by 80% and wind reduces it by 90%, and that would be conditional to using only those non-dispatchable sources, will the use of hydrogen be restricted to non-dispatchable sources of electricity?
Good question. And just to make sure I'm interpreting it correctly, it sounds like you're saying what I'm hearing your question is, if there's a more stringent definition of clean hydrogen that can only be met by solar or wind or zero carbon renewables, would you only be able to produce hydrogen by via electrolysis tied directly to those variable renewable resources? Is that correct, Sean?
Yes.
The answer, my understanding is it's not certain yet. That would be one of the kind of easiest ways to do accounting for greenhouse gas emissions produced upstream of green hydrogen, But there is discussion about creating a system where hydrogen that's produced at a time when that's produced coincidentally with excess renewable energy on the grid. There could be a counting system that allows that hydrogen to qualify as clean energy as well. Basically, understanding that if hydrogen is produced at a time when clean energy would otherwise be curtailed or where clean energy is available elsewhere on the grid, you can define that hydrogen is being produced from renewable energy. There's a lot of complications with doing that, around like questions to make sure that there's, that the hydrogen is really being produced in lockstep with the production of that clean energy, making sure that it's not taking away that clean energy from other applications it might be used for. So an additionality constraint. European hydrogen standards are investigating a lot of those questions right now. I don't know if the US is quite as far along on those particular topics, though. I know Tony and others have been following the guidance and developing guidance for this federal clean hydrogen standard pretty closely. So definitely want to check if anyone else on the call has any insights into that question.
Yeah, I'll just say that was one of the open questions in when they asked for comments on the production standard would you allow the use of RECs to qualify for the green hydrogen, so that you wouldn't necessarily have to be directly tied to a wind or a solar. And there's a lot of arguments about RECs and whether that's authentic or not, but that's how that dialogue is going.
So it would seem very much legitimate if excess electricity was not curtailed but stored somewhere. That would be very, credible. If it's curtailed and not produced, that would be a different thing.
Correct.
It's Bernie Peltier. I just jump in quickly on John's point, and I think it'll come up in the next set of slides. My view of hydrogen production is that when we go to a much more renewable and wind and solar grid, there's going to be large periods of curtailment unless we have an alternate use, like I think John was suggesting. So I very much think that letting the turbines turn and the solar panels produce in periods when overproduction is happening, and using that, call it excess power, is probably not a good term, for electrolysis to store that for other periods, long-term storage, is one of the great value propositions of this whole hydrogen discussion. So I definitely think that that's something that should be considered, definitely within the sources group. Thank you.
Thank you. So it would be contingent upon the ability to store that power.
Well, it would be contingent upon the ability to qualify that hydrogen produced during that time was produced at the times when electricity would have been curtailed. You could conceivably put because the curtailment happens at the ISO level. And so if you have a period where energy would be curtailed, for example, if prices go negative, and instead of curtailing that energy, you're running an electrolyzer during those periods, then you could say that electrolyzer was running on 100% clean energy because it was producing hydrogen at the time when the excess electricity was available.
Yes, either using it intermittently in an electrolyzer or storing the energy.
Yes, if by storage you mean storage do you mean storage in clean hydrogen, storage as clean hydrogen, or storage in like a battery?
Either a battery or a geological storage of hydrogen.
Yes, yeah, there are two potential options for storing hydrogen, for storing electricity that would otherwise have been curtailed.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, if there are no other hands, I'll move on to the next section.
I think you're good to go unless John, was there something else, or is that hand just still up from before? All right, yeah, you're good to go.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for your feedback on that particular question. And now I see we have about 20 minutes left to go into some preliminary results that have come out of some analysis that my team has done on the potential supply for hydrogen in Connecticut based on renewable energy resources that Connecticut would have access to in a zero carbon future. So going into first, I wanted to take a moment to talk a little bit about how this analysis was done and kind of what it signifies. So in looking at this question, we identified low, medium, and high supply scenarios developed based on technical energy production potential in and around Connecticut for different potential sources of energy for hydrogen production. The sources that were looked at were in a large part determined by the legislation that established the task force. And so this is divorced from the CO2, the emission considerations that we just discussed. But basically the task force called out solar, wind, nuclear, and biogas as being potential feedstocks for hydrogen production to consider. And so the sources considered in this analysis were onshore wind, offshore wind, solar, nuclear power, biogas, and we also added curtailed power or energy that would otherwise have been curtailed, because as we've discussed, that's also a significant question to discuss when talking about the ability to produce hydrogen cleanly. The opportunity to store excess energy that otherwise would have been curtailed is one of the greatest opportunities that hydrogen provides. And so we wanted to make sure that one was considered as well. And so we approached this by looking at sort of the technical production potential that exists for different feedstocks. So most of that information for renewable energy was taken by NREL geospatial modeling of solar and wind resources in Connecticut, and for offshore wind within federal waters off the North Atlantic coast. For biogas, we looked at supply potentials developed by ICF, study commissioned by the American Gas Foundation, and took different supply scenarios from that particular study. And then for curtailment, we looked at forecasted curtailment of renewable energy that was in line with the or that was identified in the ISO New England pathway study, which modeled out a decarbonization pathway for ISO New England, reducing emissions by 80% under 1990 levels by 2040, I believe. And so that pathway study identified how much curtailment was expected with those emissions constraints. And so we assumed that that was the level of excess renewable energy that would be available for hydrogen production. I'll emphasize that in all of these scenarios, we not just looked at the technical energy production potential, but we also subtracted out the renewable energy capacity that would be required for Connecticut's general decarbonization targets to be met. And so in all of these supply scenarios, we're first assuming that renewable energy that's needed for other sectors of Connecticut's economy to decarbonize are first allocated to those sectors. And so this would not be a situation in which hydrogen is competing for that renewable energy. The renewable energy would always first go towards general decarbonization targets. Before getting into specifics, I'll pause here to see if there are any questions on that methodology as I outlined.
Sorry, perhaps a related question. On the cost of electricity, what will that be assumed to be? Will that be the local conditions of Connecticut or some other cost for electricity?
Good question, John. So we didn't use retail rates or wholesale rates for the prices of electricity. That's because it was assumed that For renewable energy sources, so for onshore wind, offshore wind, and solar, it's assumed that the electrolyzer is attached directly to that renewable energy production system. And so we use the levelized cost of energy for solar and onshore wind and offshore wind, also calculated using NREL's models for LCOE calculations from different renewable energy sources. And so those were where the that's where the prices came from for the renewable energy sources. I will note that for offshore wind, there is a bit of a question mark in terms of exactly how that connection would take place. Whereas for solar and to an extent onshore wind, it's relatively easy to site an electrolyzer in proximity to that renewable energy resource, and so be able to feed the electricity very directly to the electrolyzer from the renewable energy installation. For offshore wind, that's a bit more difficult because the wind is in the middle of the ocean, and so there, as I said, a question mark in terms of how that connection would be set up. It could potentially be the case that hydrogen is produced at the point of interconnection between the offshore wind facility and the coast, or there could be another accounting system by which RECs from the offshore wind facility are purchased by Connecticut, and the electrolyzer's production is timed to coincide with wind production from that facility.
Okay, so the market conditions in Connecticut, industrial electricity costs 15.7 cents per kilowatt hour. If you find that solar would be less expensive than that, then that would have broader repercussions, that all of those fossil plants could be replaced, and that would be a good thing.
I think so, yes. So the idea is that you would be able to produce hydrogen more cheaply if you're able to source the electricity directly, because you would not have as many interconnection costs that are incorporated into the industrial cost of electricity in Connecticut, for example.
In which case, the electricity companies have not done their homework. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I'll also note a similar related point. For curtailment, we assume that the price of electricity was zero. Somewhat of a simplifying assumption, but I wanted to make it transparent for everyone as we kind of get into these numbers. So in interest of time, I'll move forward and discuss some of the results from the low case supply projection, which indicated that the technical potential for production of hydrogen could be around 2 million metric tons per year, primarily from solar and offshore wind. I'll specify that this is the technical production potential. It's not necessarily the case that Connecticut would want to produce as much hydrogen. It's very possible that filling every single available space in the state with solar to produce hydrogen would not be the preferred approach, even if we're using a scenario in which we're assuming that there's relatively high limitations on where that solar could be sited. But that said, this is meant to provide an indication of potentially how much hydrogen could be produced if Connecticut was very intent on maximizing the supply of hydrogen available to the state.
Colin, this is a quick question. Why is the price increasing from 2030 to 2040?
Really good question.
Am I reading the chart incorrectly?
No, you're not. So the LCOH number here includes the production tax credit for hydrogen, as well as the production tax credits for onshore and wind and solar, and so those tax credits expire in 2032. And so hydrogen installed before 2032 actually is able to access cheaper prices over the lifespan of that project than hydrogen that's installed in 2040, even though it is the case that renewable energy would be cheaper and electrolyzers would be cheaper in 2040 than in 2030, or assumed to be that there will be cost reductions. So that really indicates the magnitude of the production tax credit and the value it provides to hydrogen production in the shorter term.
It may be useful to note that on this slide.
That's a good call out. You're not the first one who has actually asked that question, Uur, and you're right, that was definitely a bit of an oversight. But for for everyone, this call's edification, that is the reason for the increase in costs from 2030 to 2040. So some other takeaways from this slide, there's some potential to produce hydrogen from nuclear and biogas based on assumptions around available supply, but they're relatively small compared to the production potential from solar and offshore wind. There's also some, the ability to produce hydrogen directly from curtailed energy is also there, but also relatively small, just because the level of curtailed energy, while significant, is still small in comparison to the available capacity of solar and offshore wind that Connecticut could potentially access for direct hydrogen production. It also tends to be a bit more expensive because if you're installing an electrolyzer only to take advantage of curtailed energy or curtailed renewable energy, that electrolyzer's capacity factor is very low, just because the rates of curtailment are also on the lower side. And so even though you're getting essentially free electricity, your cost per unit production is pretty high, just because you're not actually producing that much hydrogen from the installation of that electrolyzer. And so the capital costs of that electrolyzer are not spread over a particularly large level of production. Moving on to the next slide, we'll look at the mid-case projection, which is similar, but one of the major differences is that with the mid-case projection, there's potentially some spare capacity for onshore wind production in the state of Connecticut, which could allow for the production of even lower cost hydrogen, particularly in the short term when the tax credits are still available. I'll remind everyone that the primary difference between the low case and the mid case is somewhat relaxed siting restrictions on onshore wind and solar. And so you see a significant increase in the amount of not just onshore wind that can be produced, but the amount of solar that could potentially be produced as well. This isn't a particularly liberalized siting restriction or siting assumption for these two resources. This uses the siting restrictions for NREL's reference case for available renewable energy supply in Connecticut, which is their default for any capacity expansion modeling that they're doing. And so, I don't want to give the impression that these are creates a situation in which onshore wind and solar are being installed in areas where they certainly should not be installed. There are still pretty significant siting restrictions on installation of these two resources, even in this scenario. But even those relaxed siting restrictions allow for roughly twice as much hydrogen production potential to be assumed in the state of Connecticut.
Oh, and a quick question. This is Wheezy from Dominion Energy.
Yes, go ahead.
I was just curious, your assumptions around the availability of these various resources for, an off-grid application like producing hydrogen versus, committing in, for instance, the Ford capacity market to put that power onto the grid. We're assuming, all of these resources are coming online and are solely dedicated towards hydrogen production, and that they're not coming online and being financed and coming onto the system through obligations through ISO New England's markets.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. As mentioned earlier, this assumes that enough renewable energy has already been installed to meet Connecticut's clean energy goals and the region's clean energy goals, for that matter, at least as they are currently established in different state statutes.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
What is the deciding factor for how you calculate 4.5 million tons per year. What was the limitation to that you worked to?
The
That
limit,
Yeah.
sorry?
Like the acreage of Connecticut or what?
Yeah, so each resource has sort of its own limitations. For the largest ones, solar and onshore wind, NREL's capacity assumptions are based on a number of siting restrictions, inability to site in urban areas or in forests, setback requirements from different types of physical infrastructure, particularly for offshore wind. I can dig up a full accounting of all of the different siting restrictions that are considered for each of these resources, but there's a bundle of them. And so there's not necessarily one restriction that was defining the amount of overall capacity available from each resource.
So it boils down to all remaining available land.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, it's Bernie. I'll just follow on that John's question. I think if nothing else, these two slides that you've shown and the next one, which you won't have time to show, demonstrate that technically we could produce an awful lot of hydrogen. There's the question that Wheezy raised, namely, is it going to be a hydrogen market or is it going to be a circle back to electricity? But I think what is not captured in this presentation is sort of the synergistic way that I would imagine hydrogen would play in an all renewable future, where we're going to have large periods of overproduction that either we curtail, find an alternate use, buy a lot of batteries, or alternately, and preferably in my case, use that excess energy to smooth out energy production so that we can run our renewable resources full blast and carry excess energy into other seasons. So that's a lot of a comment there.
No, that's a good comment, Bernie. And I will definitely be the first to admit that these categories are a bit maybe overly simplified. There are ways to create maybe hybrid solutions where you install a electrolyzer that runs on solar, offshore wind for most of the year, a dedicated resource, but you oversize it so that in a situation in which there's spare capacity on the grid, you can produce extra hydrogen from the excess renewable energy that's available. This approach of segmenting out the potential sources in this way doesn't allow for that sort of hybridization, or doesn't consider that sort of hybridization, doesn't look at the relative economics of that approach. But you're right, there's a lot of free energy that's going to be produced, and I'm sure that enterprising companies will find a way to take advantage of it. So yes, this is really meant to be a look at how much hydrogen could Connecticut technically produce if it wanted to. And to your point on time, I'll jump ahead to the discussion section, where that is actually one of my first questions that I wanted to get everyone's feedback on while I have you here. We're looking at a technical potential for hydrogen production. Very rarely is it advisable necessarily to max out the technical production potential of anything. Is this an appropriate framing for this analysis? Is there a more appropriate framing? Is there, should we assume that this technical potential is downgraded based on pragmatic assumptions? And if so, do people have any thoughts on how that adjustment should be done?
Yeah, so I had one question on methodology that maybe gets to the technical potential question. Generally speaking, I always like to see an analysis of the technical potential, because that's the most you could get, right? That's a really good frame to have. And then you can make assumptions about what percentage of that you're actually going to deploy. But on a methodology, when I look at the relatively small amount of nuclear-derived hydrogen in the charts, is that because you're assuming that most of Millstone's output is going for power production to decarbonize power generally in the state?
That's exactly right. I can let Wheezy weigh in if she's still on the call, but we spoke with Dominion or she did help us develop some of those assumptions, informed us that Millstone was expected to run, 100% at 100% capacity out into the future, even with more renewable energy on the grid. And so that small amount of nuclear is an assumption based on that kind of those very high capacity factors being maintained.
So in that sense, it's not a raw technical potential, and that you're making assumptions that the technical potential should be in the hundreds of kilotons a year, but it's not really there because you need that power on the grid.
Yes, well, it's a technical potential subtracting out the energy that would be required to decarbonize Connecticut's operations generally. And
yeah,
so
and I think that's exactly the right methodology. I think that's good. I mean, so I think that the technical potential, the way you've calculated it, is great. I think there's a next step, right, which is what assumptions do we want to make about what percentage of that technical potential. But it's really important to know that technical potential.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Tony. Well, I know we're pretty close to time, and I'm sure people have other places to go. I'm happy to stay a bit longer if people have more questions or comments, or if you'd like to provide feedback directly by email or through the public comment process. That's very much encouraged as well.
Could you post your PowerPoint as soon as you can? This is very good. Thank you.
Yeah, of course, no problem.
This Bernie again. I will write a comment, but I guess at a minimum, I would like to envision maybe go back to Connecticut's IR integrated resource plan and look at our progress towards renewable sort of decade by decade as you're doing, and then at least imagine sort of quarterly. Imagine that we have X amount of solar, X amount of wind, how that behaves seasonally, and how we might chop off the periods of overproduction and carry them via hydrogen to the periods, especially I worry about the winter, sort of how we allow the peaks of production to fill in the valleys of production. So in metaphors, but that's sort of how I envision it.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's definitely seasonal variability in when that excess renewable energy is being produced. Well, if there are no other questions, I'll go ahead and close out the call. But thank you all for joining, and please stay engaged going forward.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.